Now let's move on to Lincoln. I don't know where to begin here. Let me, because I actually went to go see Lincoln last night, and because actually James Edwards contacted me, and he wanted me to come on the political cesspool, which I'm going to do in about 45 minutes or so. And he was like, "Oh, let's talk about movies and stuff like that." I was like, "Oh, great." And so I kind of felt like I had to do some homework and go see Lincoln. But I probably wouldn't have gone to see it on my own, but I actually liked it a little bit more than I thought I would. And the first is that despite the fact that I'm no great fan of Schindler's List or Saving Private Ryan, I think, a lot of these things that Spielberg is known for, he's clearly is a highly competent director. And so, the movie is of high quality. I mean, you have to kind of give him that. And Spielberg is kind of interesting. I thought Minority Report is kind of an interesting movie. He's capable of some good stuff.
Munich. Remember Munich a few years ago?
I never saw Munich. Was that actually good?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought it was. I mean,
we're putting ideology aside and kind of giving credit where credit's due.
Mm-hmm.
He is an interesting thing. The other thing that I thought about this is that Lincoln is a puzzle racked up an enigma enveloped in a Rubik's Cube. I mean, you can never really getting at what Lincoln actually believed or what he wanted, what he was trying to attempt politically. This is extremely difficult. And I think we should actually go into that because there's a whole controversy surrounding the movie. But anyway, I'll just preface that. I'll use that as a preface to say that I was expecting this movie just to be a kind of like unadulterated Lincoln worship, Lincoln the saint, old honest Abe, what a wonderful man. He saved the country from those evil racists down south. And granted, there was a lot of that to it. But there was also more to it. And I think actually I'll bring up some scenes where they actually lay bare a lot of these dilemmas that Lincoln was going through. I remember, a lot of people have criticized this movie for being historically inaccurate. And my view is it's a movie. Like, that's not a strong criticism in my opinion, because, as we were joking about before we got on air, Braveheart is wildly historically inaccurate, yet it's really a very cool film. Maybe
and 2 years after it came out, they have a Scottish Parliament or something.
That's true. It probably
effective in a way.
That and Trainspotting.
It was shot in Ireland by an Australian anti-Semite.
Right. Next thing you know, Scotland is seeking to break away from Britain. In Gone with the Wind, there's some myriad of problems with that movie from a historian standpoint, but that doesn't matter. You have to judge it on its own terms as a film, and you have to judge it as a work of art, not as a piece of history. It's just two very different things. So I don't know. I have to say I kind of roll my eyes a bit when some of these people are like, "Oh, look how inaccurate it is," because you have to look at it. What's a film? What's it trying to do? And also, what is the myth of Lincoln that it's trying to put forward? And to go back to what I was saying earlier, it wasn't just the Saint Lincoln myth. It was a little deeper than that. And it actually laid bare a lot of these dilemmas that he was going through. One of them was there's this long, the scene, the whole movie was kind of like a vehicle for Daniel Day-Lewis, who is a great method actor, and he's really compelling presence on screen. Sometimes
he's a little too, for me, it's like he's definitely talented, but sometimes it's like he's just flexing his acting muscles and wanting us to all to admire him for his prowess as an actor. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, that's what makes him great.
Okay.
His portrayal was very parodyable. Someone will mention something, then he'll tell a story that's tangentially related, and someone will be like, when I was in the Washington area, I visited Crystal City, and he'd be like, I had a crystal once when I was a boy. It's really just... actually, at one point when he went on one of those tangents, I started laughing. Anyway, what I was saying, he was going on... There's this long scene at one point where he's with his cabinet, and they're talking about war plans and things like this. And he was actually going into things like the Emancipation Proclamation. This whole movie is about the movie is not a full biography. It's basically focuses on just a few months of his life when he was trying to pass the 13th Amendment through the House of Representatives. 13th Amendment, effectively abolished slavery. And he was talking about the Emancipation Proclamation. And, a lot of people just hear the term Emancipation Proclamation and they think, oh, wow, what a great thing. He emancipated all these people. But you have to remember, as he said, he did not, where he could emancipate slaves, he did not. And where he could not emancipate slaves, he did. So essentially, in the border states and Confederate states that had been that were under Union control, he did not emancipate slaves. However, in those states that were out of his control, he kind of legally emancipated them. His justification for doing that, as Lincoln points out in the film, was essentially accepting the premise that slaves are property and expropriating them from a foreign war power. I think in an interesting way, he kind of laid bare this fact that Lincoln is not this simple figure who, had a great, he just freed the slaves or something like that. It was much more complicated.
They're saying that he did that because he couldn't do anything else, or are they actually saying he actually was a bit of a cunt, for want of a better word?
Well, we should go into this. I mean, Lincoln, again, as I mentioned before, Lincoln is a puzzle wrapped up in an enigma, wrapped up in a Rubik's Cube. Like, you can't understand him. And once you look at one aspect of them, there are all these other aspects of them that seem to disprove what you thought. The Emancipation Proclamation is one of them, where he was making some kind of deal, and he was allowing people to hold slaves. He said to the, I think it was the editor, of New York Times or something. If I could keep the Union and maintain slavery, I would. If I could, essentially, it was all about the Union. Some of the first blacks to ever enter the White House. In the movie, they bring blacks into the House of Representatives to kind of look down upon Congress as like their bad conscience or something. But in reality, he actually brought blacks to the White House in order to talk with them about decolonization or repatriation to Africa. When in the Frederick Douglass debate, the Lincoln Douglas debates, where he was not Frederick Douglass, Lincoln Douglas debates. He said all this explicit white supremacy thing. There's the only way
he'd have to, wouldn't he, because of the time he lived in. So,
that's also very true. So I mean, again, this is a big question. It's to being a racist in the mid-19th century was hardly some strange position. It was kind of like nowadays like watching Gangnam Style or something. It was totally normal. And so did he just have to say something like that to the people? The way they don't get, needless to say, this is based on a book by Doris Kearns Goodwin, who, besides having plagiarized a couple of times, she's really like one of these sunny side up liberal historians. Everything's great. America is this wonderful narrative leading towards liberalism, and everyone's happy. Yeah. She's terrible. I mean, anyway, this is based on a book by her, and is written by Tony Kushner, who wrote Angels in America, and he one of the totally sentimental play about gays with AIDS. It's like totally a set piece in the 90s. And then you have Spielberg on top of it, who Spielberg, needless to say, he can bring out the buckets of sentimentality when he needs to. So, so they're not going to go into Lincoln as a white supremacist. But was he? I mean, this is the big question. Is the way to think about Lincoln is that he was leading towards liberalism, he was one step towards Martin Luther King, or is the way to think about Lincoln is that he was a lot like Garibaldi or Otto von Bismarck or something? He was a nationalist who probably was a racist, and he wanted to maintain the Union. And even if that meant having slavery, he would have been willing to tolerate that if that were the case. Or was he like a lot of Republicans who were essentially anti-slavery racist? That is, people who hated the slavery because A, it undercut a lot of white farmers, and B, it just brought Africans to the continent. And you had all these, it's kind of like people disliking, businessmen who bring immigrants over to work for them. It's like, wow, you got, money is to blame for this. So it really is, who is he? I don't know.
I'm just remembering this. He was somebody who puzzled and fascinated Joe Sobran, the late Joe Sobran, who was going to write a book about him, I think, at some point. I really wish he had. But he wrote extensively about Lincoln and the Lincoln myth. He knew that the myth that's been told about Lincoln was false, was sentimental crap, just like you've been saying. But at the same time, also like you've been saying, he seemed to think that there was something even more ambiguous. Not that he's all good, not that he's evil, like a lot of Lincoln haters might say, but just that he, like you said, he's an enigma. You can't really. It's hard to get at the heart of him.
Yeah. And there seems to be something there. I mean, and I think it is interesting. The way, essentially, that Spielberg is portraying Lincoln is basically as a consummate politician, that a guy who can be ruthless, who can be quite cagey at times, but also wants to get the job done. So essentially, the movie, the narrative of the movie focuses on his attempts to get the 13th Amendment passed through the House of Representatives, which is very much a kind of a raucous place as it is in this movie. Much more interesting place. Big speeches and congressmen calling he's like, yes, the gentleman from Kentucky is a detestable insect. That was actually kind of a fun aspect of the movie. Anyway, there's a character played by Tommy Lee Jones who's Thaddeus Stevens. And Thaddeus Stevens is, of course, he's a congressman from Pennsylvania, and unfortunately that state has seemed to be a magnet for religious extremists of all sorts, not just the Amish, but all these, Seventh-day Adventists, all these people. They seem to all congregate in Pennsylvania. I was actually visiting Paul Gottfried, he's a professor at Elizabethtown College, and we were just going over it, and it's just like, I really liked visiting Paul, because Paul and his wife Mary are very sensible, down-to-earth people. But it seems like every time you turn around the corner, there's some insane cult that involves starving yourself to death for Christ. There's these one uber Protestants who actually had a monkish they were nuns and monks, and they would wake up every night waiting for the second coming, and they would eat half a loaf of bread and maybe a couple of grapes for sustenance all day, and many died as a result. I mean, it's just every lunatic from the continent just was shipped to Pennsylvania. And anyway, to bring it back, you can see this in Thaddeus Stevens, who's a radical Republican, a abolitionist, a total lunatic, and you can see that there's a certain Christianity itself is it has so many different forms. It is that's what is fascinating about Christianity, is a myriad of different expressions around the world and throughout history. One of those expressions is this kind of abolitionism, this extreme demand for equality, this, equality at all cost. And I think Thaddeus Stevens is really an expression of that heretical Christianity, hopefully at least, but a certain kind of Christianity. And, he is and essentially Lincoln and Thaddeus Stevens, when there's this scene where they're talking, I think in the kitchen or something. And essentially, the way it's depicted is that Thaddeus Stevens is a great hero. He's a great American. He is a Lincoln, but he's in a hurry. He wants equality too quickly, and Lincoln will kind of take it slow and all this kind of stuff. And Lincoln will criticize, and I think Thaddeus was talking about his idea of Reconstruction. It was extreme wealth expropriation, all this kind of stuff. And Lincoln was like, well, we shouldn't do that exactly, but essentially they all agreed. They agreed on the essence of the matter, which is human equality. But Thaddeus Stevens was just a little bit, he was in a hurry about it. And Lincoln, in a cagey and strategic way, kind of bided his time, but did achieve his goals. That was basically what the movie was putting forward. So the ideal of democracy, or the human freedom, it was this kind of, that was the ideal, and we're all aiming towards that, but we all kind of have different paths to reach it, and Lincoln's is best. That's how I would kind of sum up the thing. And so, in a way, this is why myths are more powerful than facts. And I was getting in this big conversation with a a friend, of America, and he was like, oh, in the Declaration of Independence, they complain about Indian savages, and Thomas Jefferson, he clearly didn't really believe in human equality. He was a slave owner, but that doesn't matter. Those are all facts. Facts are irrelevant. What's powerful are myths. And the myth created by the Declaration of Independence is that all men are created equal. And I think what I think is so powerful about the Lincoln myth is that you could talk to people and say, well, didn't you know that Lincoln was also a racist, and he also wanted to he at least countenanced the idea of sending blacks back to Africa. He was a nationalist, and he was a tyrant in a way. He disobeyed habeas corpus, all these kind of constitutional norms. And even in Spielberg's film, he openly talks about disobeying the Constitution. And essentially they will say that doesn't matter because it was all about human freedom, and the ends justify the means, and we got there through Lincoln.
Do they mention at all, is there anything about the atrocities committed by Union Army, like Sherman's March to the Sea, burning down everything that he touches, more or less? Is that touched upon?
Well, it is kind of touched upon. Lincoln at one point was talking about, I don't want any punishment for the Union, for the Confederates. Lincoln was kind of depicted as this nice, grandfatherly figure. But they certainly didn't dwell on that. There is a kind of scene. I mean, the opening scene was almost like, again, if I were to create a parody, I don't think I would do it. I mean, it's this opening scene where like black Union soldiers are like literally stomping like Southern rebels like into the dirt, like a boot on a face, a black Union boot, like pushing a Confederate's head into, like drowning him in mud. I mean, that's like, so they if anything, they kind of glorify violence as, to achieve equality, anything is justified. And then after that, Lincoln is sitting there and these two black soldiers are talking to him. They're of course brilliant. And then one of the black soldiers comes out and he's like talking about equal pay. He was like, do you know that a black captain, he only gets paid 80 cents on the dollar for a white one? I was like, give me a break. This is not like... There's
a glass ceiling for the black.
You might as well have said that.
I was complaining about the glass ceiling.
I was like, this is not Women's Lib from the 1990s. Anyway, I've said my piece on this. What do you guys think?
Have either of you seen the movie The Conspirator? I think it was released either last year or a couple of years ago.
No, I haven't seen that. It was Robert Redford. It was about the attempted assassination.
It was directed by Robert Redford, and it's about the trial of, I believe her name is Mary Surratt, somebody who knew Booth, the assassin of Lincoln, and in her trial afterwards, of course, she was. It's interesting, in a historical sense, because it takes the side of the Southerners in a interesting way. Of course, it's set after the Civil War is over, after Lincoln's dead, and after John Wilkes Booth has already done what he's done and then been shot afterwards, and etc. But it suggests that there was a lot of, that it was essentially a show trial. She ran the boarding house, but she didn't really know anything. They were out for blood, and it was suggested that there was this vengeful attitude that the Union had toward the South after the war because of the assassination of Lincoln. That might, again, I think the suggestion was that it might not have happened. The harsh Reconstruction years might have been averted in some way if Lincoln had survived and had not been killed.
I've actually even heard historians who take that view. The interesting thing to remember, though, is that there were these radical Republicans, these Thaddeus Stevens in Congress, who, if they had actually had their say, I think Reconstruction would not have just been the disaster what it was. It might have resembled beyond the Bolsheviks' imagination.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, you have to remember the abolitionists. I mean, they were, again, this is why all these things are just so equivocal, and you can't really get a handle on them. I mean, there were plenty of conservative Republicans who hated slavery and hated the South and hated the slave owners, most of all, for essentially racialist motives, that they didn't want all these white farmers, yeoman farmers, to be undercut by slavery, which is clearly happening. They didn't want blacks in the continent. They didn't want slavery moving into their states, not because there were some like great moral ideals, but because they didn't want blacks moving into their states. So everything is very, very equivocal. And then you also had these abolitionists who in a way, that whole ideology won the day, in the sense that they truly wanted to achieve real existing equality. I mean, some of these abolitionists were theorizing of, what will one day happen with intermarriage and all this kind of stuff. This is actually another good point in the movie, which I should bring up. There's this interesting point in the film where Thaddeus Stevens, he's just had his conversation with Lincoln. And Lincoln, in a sense, agreed with him that, equality is the greatest thing in the history of the world. And but it's just a matter of how we get there. And then he's like, I need you to play along. And then there's this moment where they're in Congress, and there's actually a congressman from I believe he's from Ohio named Wood. Someone I bet if there are any historians listening, I'm sure he was an interesting figure. And he's a very flamboyant person. He almost reminds me of Booth. He's like an actor, and he gives these great speeches about white supremacy and like what will happen if we allow freedom to blacks. Like one day women might vote or something, and everyone's like, oh, like that would never happen. But anyway, he was there, and he was like he was doing an inquisition on Thaddeus Stevens. And he was like, what do you want? Like, do you just want legal equality? Or do you truly want real equality? And of course, Thaddeus Stevens wants real equality. In fact, in the film, Thaddeus Stevens, and I don't care about giving away a spoiler, but so anyway, close your ears if you want to go see the movie. At the end of the movie, Thaddeus Stevens, he goes into his apartment, and his black housemate helps him take off his jacket. And then you slowly realize, they get into bed together, and you realize that essentially Thaddeus Stevens is living with this black woman. And so clearly Thaddeus Stevens, like not only in his life, but in his writings and explicit statements, he wants full equality. He wants voting equality, wealth redistribution. And
he's the real deal.
He is the real deal, yeah. And I almost admire him for being the real deal. I think some of these other people didn't understand what the ultimate implications of talking about equality and things were, but he did. Anyway, he was put on the stand by Wood, and he was saying, what do you want? And then then essentially Thaddeus Stevens, and played by Tommy Lee Jones, he pauses, and then he was like, we want legal equality, nothing more. Legal equality, nothing more. So essentially he is lying, like outright lying. He admits he's lying. And while he's lying, all this music starts playing in the background, like John Williams score. So it's like, da 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 da. It's like, he is lying. Like, so basically, you have this like leftist radical pretending to be like semi-conservative lying, and that
so you've got Lincoln who's pretending, and then you've got Thaddeus Stevens also pretending, and then behind the double pretense, there's this drive for absolute equality, sort of Marxian equality.
So it's like, this is wonderful. Like, he's oh, he's really come through, kind of thing. You can kind of see it, in the, you see it in these conservatives, like modern day conservatives, how, it's like, we don't want anything crazy. We just want, everyone's treated equal. That's all we want, but once you kind of go down this equalitarian path, you basically end up at some kind of horrible...
It's sort of revolution pretending to be evolution.
Right. And it doesn't ever stop. Like, I guess the big irony, when that guy said, what's going to happen once we free blacks, or like women might vote one day or something, like that did happen. Like, there is a logical progression. Once you agree to basic premises, you do end up at, America 2012. So that's why I believe, and this is where I disagree pretty strongly with, a lot of people, including like Jared Taylor. I think we really... it doesn't matter what some of the racist opinions were of the founding fathers and early Americans. The ball got rolling, and it ended up here. And
but how much is this down to luck? You see, because things go a certain way, and a lot of the factors are actually quite random and based on luck. I mean, like I'm just checking out the 1860 election.
Yeah.
When Lincoln actually became president, and he got surprisingly few votes, and the reason he became president was because the Democrat vote was so badly split. So, like Lincoln, I think he received 1,866,000 votes, and then there were actually two Democrats, Douglas and Breckinridge, and together they got well over 2 million.
Yeah.
So the guy gets in on basically because a very, very fortuitous split in the opposition, and then that leads to a certain war, which enables him to do certain other things. And so one thing kind of leads to another, and it's all kind of based on luck rather than principle, I think.
Well, don't you think we would have this would have happened by a different route? Ultimately, I guess, I've said this. This brings up this talk I gave at the Traditional Britain Group and the Minkin Club. I guess I am a Hegelian at heart, and I mean that very seriously. I think you're
coming out of the closet.
I'm out of the
Hegelian now.
Out of the closet.
Big announcement.
Yeah. Right.
Richard Spencer is a Hegelian.
I'm Hegelian. My mother won't talk to me anymore. It's really sad. She didn't know what Hegelian was, but it sounded, gay or something. I'm Hegelian in the sense of I think there are basic principles and there are consequences, and we're only able to understand the spirit at the very heart of a founding after the fact. Now we are able to understand the true meaning of the Declaration of Independence now that we've kind of lived through it. And I do hold that, Colin. I don't think it's a matter of luck. There's no such thing as luck.
So you think it would have happened? It was all set for it when the Declaration of Independence was signed and the whole proclamation that all men are created equal. That it was inevitable that we would go down the path to where we are now.
In a way, I do, and I'm sure many listeners will find that kind of outrageous to say. But in a way, I do. But I think it was more than I don't think it was just that piece of paper written by Jefferson.
Yeah, but Hegelianism is supposed to be progressive in some way, isn't it? I mean, you start from a kind of lower stage, and then you have various contradictions which work themselves out at a higher stage, and each stage leads to some kind of progress.
Right, I'm a regressive Hegelian. I think it just keeps getting worse.
Yeah, your position is very regressive Hegelian because what's actually happened is, I think you'd probably agree with this yourself, is not sustainable in the long term.
Oh, I don't think it is sustainable. No, I'm not a Hegelian in a kind of Fukuyamian sense of, there's one great goal for everyone, and we'll all reach it one day, and then it will just end, essentially. And there will be, maybe still some violence around the edges. Essentially that one, end of history type society is there. I'm not really a Fukuyamian in that sense. I'm a Hegelian in the sense that I think there are essentially seasons for civilizations and cultures, and that they kind of have a destiny that's at the very beginning, and that you can kind of fully understand after it's unraveled. And I don't just
but
think it's a Declaration of Independence.
How did the liberation of the slaves lead to and promote American power?
American power?
Yes, because Hegelianism is all about the rise of certain states to prominence, and they dominate the historical narrative.
Well,
the liberation of the slaves seems to be almost like an irrelevance to the growth of American power, which is all based upon various kinds of northern industrialism and also
it's based more than that.
Certain events in Europe where all the European powers basically shot themselves in the foot.
Well, I think all that is true, but clearly the American will to power was based at some level, in some sense, that it was the greatest society, that it was a liberating society. And though this is obviously changing in the 21st century, but a lot of people are wildly attracted to it. American will to power is
based on the idea that they got lucky.
Well, I don't doubt at all that America got lucky, and maybe you can explain some of its success by the fact that European industry was in rubble and so on and so forth. But a lot of that will to power in that sense was that of why it was popular and kind of legitimate was this idea that America is this revolutionary, liberating country that is, we kind of went through this process ourselves, and now the world, everything under our authority will soon go through the same process of black liberation, women's liberation, and so forth that we went through.
Gay liberation.
Yeah, gay liberation, ultimately. But I don't. I will say this.
My sense of that is that they kind of rebooted that in the 1950s, basically because they had to, because of the pressure they were getting from the Soviet Union.
Both the USA and the USSR, the US and the SU. There's all these weird kind of mirror images in a way. They are two ideological societies, and they were
founded on a revolution.
Yeah, founded on revolution, founded on equalitarian, different versions of equalitarian ideals. And I think liberalism has essentially won, but it has proved more lasting than communism and so forth. But both of those were revolutionary societies that had kind of unending revolutionary goals. I mean, I don't think that was always in practice. I think there are a lot of Americans that were fairly sensible foreign policy actors, and I think a lot of the Soviets were actually much more than Americans realize, particularly conservatives, were actually much more realistic actors in the Soviet realm. But if you really get at the essence of their ideology, it was, there was no bounds to it. It was a global thing, much like a kind of the religious impulse to war. I mean, it was everyone must be an American, everyone must be a communist. And these are two very radical societies that very different than France. Well, France has its own mission civilisatrice, but so maybe it is a kind of Western Faustian bargain. But Italians just don't have an ideological society. Period. It just doesn't. It's almost laughable to turn the world. Will the world go Italy?
Well, they did have the Catholic Church for a while, didn't they?
Very true. So there's clearly a kind of, I guess maybe Italy doesn't really have it as much anymore, but that is very true. And so I think there probably is a kind of Western impulse towards unboundedness and things like that. But I think in, at least in our time, that has been centered on Moscow and Washington. But I'll just mention this real quickly because this goes back to a lot of stuff I was talking about in these lectures, but I don't think it's simply Jefferson's declaration. I think a lot of this had to do with, the types of religious people who came to the United States, and that they were, if you look at Christianity, European Christianity, the Catholic Church and Protestant versions, it was attached to the aristocracy. It was a European expression. It was attached to European styles of aesthetics, European power, a European sense of itself. And, you can't look at Notre Dame and not, even Colin, the great dyed-in-the-wool pagan can't look at Notre Dame and say that's not a expression of the European spirit. The kinds of religious fanatics who came to the United States, came to America, were trying to escape all that. They thought of it as all of that stuff is corruption. All that stuff is you're corrupting the true dogma. You're getting away from the real religion. What we think of as tradition, they thought of as corruption. And so, in a way, the Declaration and the Independence Declaration document resonated with American religious people in a way that it wouldn't otherwise. So, if you look at these things, the left and the revolutionary left in Europe was always anti-Christian. You had to go tear down cathedrals. You had to be iconoclastic. In America, the religious believers were the most revolutionary people. You had pulpits calling for, supporting, secession, abolition, so on and so forth. So you really have a fundamental asymmetry between this certain type of religious Christianity, a kind of biblical Christianity, and also kind of Hebraic Christianity, a kind of notion of separateness and Old Testament Christianity that is very different than Christianities in Europe. And so I think there's a lot of different things that established America kind of down this road. And one of them is the enlightened humanism and people like Jefferson. Another one of them is just the type of Christians that seem to kind of dominate the way Christianity developed. So in a way, I guess if I would sum up my position, is that I agree with Spielberg and a lot of liberals. I think they are getting at something right. There is a kind of essential American impulse towards equality, and people like Lincoln were kind of like the vessels that impulse expressed itself through.
You agree with Spielberg that that's what America is all about.
I do.
You don't agree.
I agree.
You don't agree with Spielberg that it's a good thing.
Oh, I think it's the worst possible thing. But yeah.
Well, that's the way to be superior, isn't it? By being more moral and seeming to be more moral, but by believing in equality more, you become more superior.
Well, that's true. I mean, clearly there's a snobby element to the left. You know, it's like I'm more multi-culti than you are. I'm blah blah blah. But still, I just think there is a kind of world spirit to America, that equality is at its very core, and breaking away from European tradition is at its very core. And you kind of can't get away from that until America totally collapses. It's almost like we can't get away from that. And that was probably a source of strength at one time, but it's obviously now a source of weakness. But I do think that is the essence of this country.
But you can't actually, if your strength is based on this kind of worship of equality, it's very hard to change gear and make it something else. So,
I completely agree.
So you're saying that America will basically be dragged down by this, and it's something else which doesn't have this spirit of equality will rise up in its place, and it will be a completely different society, racially and culturally.
Absolutely, yes. That's what I'm saying.
Maybe another series of secessions.
Well, maybe, but if Americans just secede and reproduce America, it's almost like the kinds of people who talk about secession, I'm very skeptical of secession for a number of reasons, but the kind of people who talk about it are kind of like, well, you know, the federal government has thrown away the Constitution. We need to go back to the founder. It's like they want to recreate the problem in a smaller form, a smaller yet more concentrated form that will end up at the same place.
Do you think that that if the Confederacy had won the Civil War, there still would have been this degeneration?
That's a very good question.
The problem that was there from the start.
That's a good question, and I think maybe with someone like Jefferson Davis, that would have happened because he was a kind of liberal. I think if people like Alexander Stephens had prevailed, Alexander Stephens in his Cornerstone in the Confederacy speech said that we are creating a new society based on the notion that Thomas Jefferson was dead wrong. I mean, he said that explicitly. If people like Alexander Stephens had prevailed, Alexander Stevenson truly wanted to create a new order that was based on fundamentally different principles than the United States. But it is a question. I mean, I think, you know, with the Confederacy, because the Confederacy would have eventually ended slavery. I think most people would agree with that. But what would have really happened? Would they have just become some new liberal society? You know, they slowly emancipate blacks, and then they vote, and then it just becomes like the South now.
Brazil.
Or Brazil, or worse, yeah. I mean, I don't know the answer to that question. But I do know that I think, you know, Stevenson was a kind of hero in the sense that he seemed to fully recognize the problem. And that it wasn't just like states' rights or, you know, oh, he's a tyrant, he's not obeying the Constitution. He fundamentally understood the problem, which is that we need to create a society based on the notion that Thomas Jefferson is wrong. And I do think we need to create a society. I graduated from Thomas Jefferson's University. I should.
Oh.
I should. We need to create a fundamentally different society than my university. The University of Virginia, of course, was a very beautiful place, and I had a good time there.
Oh, you're talking about the University of Virginia.
Yeah. And Thomas Jefferson was a fascinating person. I mean, I think he really is a kind of like Leonardo figure, but you know, at the end of the day, he's an equalitarian. He's not going to support what they want. I mean, it's almost like the only way Americans know how to react against the federal government or liberalism or whatever or leftism is more liberalism. You know, it's like the Tea Party is, you know, the Constitution, free markets. You know, there's no.
Well, it's like this invocation of patriotism. It seems like the right always, you know, rallies around waving the flag and saying America, fuck yeah. That seems like a staple of the American right, and it's going to have to change. It sounds like, you know, if we're really planning to get anywhere.
Oh yeah, we can't just go on and asserting this thing that's been killing us. You know, America was born in the age of the state, at least, was born in the age of Enlightenment, and the only way Jefferson could articulate this state founding was through French Enlightenment humanist ideals. And while these other nations can look back to millennia of histories and traditions and things like that, America can look back to biblical Christianity and the French Enlightenment. And that's a problem. I essentially, that if I were to sum up my view of America in one phrase, it would be that its foundations are totally off. And again, it's so like, again, I just reiterate, I mean, the conservative reaction is just towards more liberalism and towards more capitalism, or or more extreme concentrated versions of liberalism, and it's just that's not getting us anywhere.